It's interesting to have you guys seated up here because usually you're out there when you're doing the work, and looking at an extraordinary theater like this, it's interesting to think about where the ideal spot might be. But where do you guys usually find yourselves when you're sort of in the heart of the work that you do?
I think there's generally this idea that there's a reference position. So if you go into a mixing theatre, which is, some of them are about this size, most of them are a bit smaller, the reference position is usually 2/3 back in the centre, and that's kind of where some technical guy will come in and line all the speakers up from, and they'll have an idea that that's kind of an ideal position to be in. So that's kind of like the ideal. The idea is, that we take into account a little bit that there are going to be people sat in row A, seat 1 or whatever, and, like a little bit removed from the sweet spot. So you have to be careful. That's like where Chris talks about dialogue clarity. You have to make sure that that's, working for everybody rather than just, the lucky cameraman out there who's sat in the sweet spot. So.
Yeah, if you put too much in the surround speakers at certain points, you really do compromise intelligibility. To give you an idea of, setup, that Gilly and I were in Delane Lee, the Warner Brothers studio in London, where we mixed this. Typically, and it can change from gig to gig, but I would inhabit the left-hand side of this mixing desk, have multiple faders. Gilly would be on the right side, and again, we'd be aiming to be in the sweet spot for the reference for the room, and then we just look at each other and try and communicate with everybody in the room. But you have a pretty standard setup with the various audio machines like Pro Tools and so on, and we just mix away with bank of faders and other gizmos.
So what is the movie like beforehand when you first kind of get in there? I mean, when you watch it all the way through, does it just sound kind of basic land? I mean,
it's usually a lot of material. So the guys who've cut the sounds and recorded the sounds have put it all together, and they've put it all on tracks in sync with the picture. And there's usually this point where Ron will come into the room and will say, we have this thing called a faders up. So it means every fader is set to 0. There's no EQ on anything. There's nothing controlling the levels. It's just the sounds playing into the desk, into the speakers. And usually it's not always a complete train wreck, but it's just putting all the sound up there, making sure all the sounds are there. But it also helps identify where you want to carve the sound down, what sounds you think key to a moment, and what possibly sounds you could sort of draw back from, the main focus. And so it's always a really interesting little exercise, eh?
I mean, earlier in the whole process, the actual sound on the early edit can be relatively, not crude is maybe a bit unfair, but it's pared back a long way. Some of the original location sound would be used, and it would be difficult to hear all the dialogue. There'd be maybe some temp music in there prior to the actual recorded score. So if we were watching the movie for the first time, often it would be a fairly simple track. Sometimes the sound effects crew will have already provided sound effects for the cutting room, so they will be mixed into this Avid playout, this picture cut. So it can vary how sophisticated it is at that point, but sometimes you don't have a lot of music, or you have a relatively small scale, and then yeah.
And it's also the picture we're using is often unfinished, so you've got often lots of green screen. You've got where you don't see backgrounds, you don't see the extended sea. You might have previs animation, so you might have a whale that's kind of like rectangular and just with really rudimentary motion and kind of nothing to really match sync to. So it's kind of like you have to think a bit ahead and try and sort of use your imagination to how these scenes are going to come together and what's going to be important a bit as well.
And I imagine the director has to go through that process as well, while also conveying to you whatever this kind of final vision is. So somebody like Ron Howard, presumably, I mean, I know this was the first time you guys worked with him, but he's been at this for a while, would know how to sort of speak on your terms to some degree. But what is that skill set? What does a filmmaker need to tell sound people in order to get these things across?
And in this instance, we were fortunate because he had to have a certain amount of trust kind of preemptively, because he hadn't worked with us, so he had to trust that we had experience in other films prior to actually working with him. it was actually amazing how quickly it came together, because we didn't meet him. I'd met him, say hello and shake his hand and say we're looking forward to working with him. But actually, his arrival in the studio, again, Gilly was describing, we'd play our first thoughts on maybe reel one, which might be the 20-minute first reel. And then it was really just a case of communicating really quickly. And I mean, he's a charming and kind of incredible person that was so encouraging in terms of what we were doing. He would just quietly maybe specify certain areas where he wanted to go in a slightly different direction. But for us, very positively, he was very positive early on about how we were approaching the film sound. So, I don't know if we lucked out in that respect, but it was great. And
he's also, he comes to it, we're a little bit technical and creative, and he's really just a storyteller. He wants to tell the story. So for him, the important things are all the beats that, make the story work, and, those can be sound effects or dialogue, or, where music cues are coming in and how they come in. So it's just shaping notes around those story moments that he really just hits hard on and just wants to get across. And that's why his editor, Dan Hanley, was really integral as well, because he was able to be with us a bit more because Ron was dealing with visual effects and various sort of grading issues and things like that. So it was really important to have like the editor who absolutely knows all the story beats and knows all the cuts that really matter, just to sort of keep us on track and make sure we understood what the intent was.
I mean, just to give you an idea, again, in terms of the process, we'd do a run on the film, and again, budget determines this really with many films we work on, but we'd hopefully get the opportunity to watch the film again together, take more notes, and readdress certain things. So maybe it might be subtle music levels early on in certain scenes or whatever, and we'll look at it again and go, that decision we made last week, I think we should go in a different direction here, and so on. So if you're lucky, you have a bit of time to make those decisions. Too much time, maybe like anybody who does any creative process, painting, making music, sometimes takes away a little bit of the magic if you overanalyze. But hopefully we get the right amount of time.